Hey, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are going to continue the game engine series, and we will also start somewhat of a mini-series regarding the Sandbox project. So up until now, all the stuff we programmed inside of the game engine's code project. And that's fine, because we are programming a game engine after all. But what if we now want to write an actual video game? Where do we put the code? We can't put it inside of the game engine's code project because that's only the code that belongs to the game engine. So we have to put it somewhere else. And that's where the sandbox comes into play. Because the game engine actually gives us a place where we can write our own code using the game engine's features. If we have a sandbox for our game engine, that means that it's a code project where we use the game engine's features to build some kind of program. That could be like a video game or like anything else. It just means that there is no actual purpose for this project. It's just a place where we can experiment with the engine. But to make this possible, we have to extend the engine a bit. Because right now, we could only make that sandbox project and then we could call the game's init, run, and shutdown method. But there's no way to actually push any kind of like custom code inside of the game's main loop. The only thing that's running right now is the stuff that's inside of the game's run method. And if we would make a sandbox project, we cannot push any kind of code in there. And that's where layers come in. And that's also going to be our topic for today, layers. And I don't want to talk too much about layers because the concept is actually really easy to understand. You have to imagine the game engine's main loop as some kind of bracket or as some kind of container. And with each layer that we push in there, we can like execute code. And whatever we want to execute on that layer, we could have like a debug layer, we could have a like a UI layer that would be called an overlay, and that will be a topic of the next episode. We could have logic layers in terms of if you imagine that we are making a video game that contains levels, like each level could be one layer, and so on and so on. So the general concept here is that we are pushing these layers, and they are just some kind of container for code inside of the game engine's main loop, and then they are executed on every frame. And without any further ado, I'm going to put myself into the bottom right corner, and we are going to start implementing layers. But before we start with the implementation of the layers, I have to apologize to you because in the last episode, while I was editing it, something got lost. And this is this bit here, where we are now using the running bool variable to control the game's main loop, and it's based on us either pressing escape or pressing the close button on the window to set running to false, and as soon as this happens, the loop will not run again and the game will end. So now that we got the missing stuff from the last episode out of the way, let's start with the layer implementation. We are going to add two new files to the core folder. First one is called layer.h. Second one is called layer.cpp. Now the standard stuff, we are going to include layer.h. We are going to use the apostrophes for that. Layer.h in layer.cpp. Also add the namespace Lucy. Copy the namespace. Go into layer.h. Paste the namespace. This is a step-by-step tutorial today. And now we just create the class layer. So now let's define the contents of the layer class. We're going to have a private string called name. It's not necessary to have a name here because we are not going to use that name to somehow find or identify these layers, but it's good for debugging. So I'm just going to leave that name in there. We have to include the string library. And then we are going to have a couple of methods as well. That would be the constructor, just the default constructor. And then we have a constructor that takes a const reference to a string name. And we are going to give that value to our class member name. So the next thing we have to do is to define a destructor for the layer class. And it also has to be a virtual destructor. Because through some kind of C++ internals, there could be a problem if we would delete an object of a derived class through a pointer that is of the type of a base class. So I'm not going to go into this now because this can take like 20 minutes to explain that. If you want to know about this, like, let me know in the comments, then I can make a dedicated episode through that. But we're just going to define this as default as well. And now if you follow people like Scott Meyer, which are like very famous in the C++ community, they will tell you that if you have a destructor, you also have to have the following 4 functions because of the rule of 5. Because as soon as we define one of these functions inside of our class, C++ will not generate them automatically for us anymore. So we have to define all of them. And that's what we're going to do. Those 2 are the copy and the move constructor, and those 2 are the copy and move assignment operator. And they are all defaulted as well. So we are not going to implement any functionality for them. C++ will do that for us. And the last thing we have to do is to define 4 more virtual methods here. That would be virtual void init, and they will all be void on their return type. And they will be called init update, render, and shutdown. Now I'm going to create the definitions for these functions. And let's compile that. Seems fine. And since the layer class will pretty much only serve as a base class for our derived layers in the Sandbox project, we will leave them empty for now because there's just no functionality to put in there. So the next step, since we don't have the Sandbox project yet, we are going to make a folder inside of our source folder called Sandbox. And inside of this folder, we will create a file called sandbox.cpp. And in this file, we will move everything that is inside of our main.cpp file right now and paste it in there. And then we will just delete the main.cpp. And if we build this now, the software should still run. And it does, because C++ doesn't care where the main function is located. As long as it's somewhere to be found, then it can be run. Now we are creating the layer files. The first file will be called sandbox layer.h. And the other file will be called sandbox layer.cpp. And inside of this, we are going to include sandbox layer.h. And now we will make a new namespace, and the namespace will be called sandbox. We are going to copy the namespace inside of the header file, and we are creating the class sandbox layer. Now we are going to let this class inherit the functionality from the layer class inside of our engine. We have to include that here, obviously. So we are going Lucy core layer. That should work. And the next thing would be to implement the functions. We are going to have a constructor here that is going to call the constructor of the base class layer instead of the game engine. And we are going to give a static string called sandbox layer. And now we are going to override the virtual methods from the layer class. So that would be init. The keyword here is override. And update, render, and shutdown. Now create all of the definitions for these functions. That worked. Let's build that. It works fine. So the next step would be to add some functionality, some logic here. We're just going to add some prints. We're going to make that really easy today. And so we're just going to include IO stream, sandbox layer init, and a new line. Just going to copy that in here. And then we're just going to exchange the function names. And what we're also going to do is we're going to go into our main loop inside of the game class, and we're going to take the draw call to the renderer, which is drawing our red triangle, and we're going to move that into the sandbox layers update function. Remove the new lines, and we also have to include the renderer here now. So we're just going to include Lucy renderer, and that should build. If we run this now, we will see that there is no triangle anymore because we didn't supply the engine with this layer, and that's what we are going to do now. So we are going into our game class, and we are going to introduce a vector. We have to include the vector class, the vector library, just vector. And we also have to include the layer class. Now we are, the vector will have, the element stored in the vector will be of type layer pointer, and the vector will be called layers. So why are we storing these layers as pointers? We could also just make a copy of them. Well, there are some use cases where you would have to access the layer from the Sandbox project as well. Like the normal use case would be that you just give the layer to the game engine and then you forget about it because the game engine is executing these functions and the logic inside of the layer will be run. So there's no need to get data from the layer inside of the Sandbox project. But there can be cases, especially if you want to use a UI layer, where you would have to send data to the UI layer from the sandbox. And this is why we need a pointer here. So we can access the same instance of the layer from the game engine and also from the Sandbox project. So the last thing for the game class would be to add a function to actually push these layers inside of the vector. We're just going to call that add layer, and that will take a layer pointer called layer. Now we are going to create the definition for this function, and all it does is emplace the layer at the end of the vector. And there's actually more to do for the game class still, because we also have to call these functions inside of the layer. So we're going to add a for loop for each layer in layers, inside of the game's start function. For each layer in layers, we are going to call layer.init. Like this. And this is also wrong. This needs to be an arrow because it's a pointer. Now we are going to copy that inside of the main loop, inside of the game's run function. And here we will call layer update. And we will also call that inside of, and we will also paste that loop inside of the shutdown method. And here we will do two things. We will call the shutdown method, and then we will delete the object behind the pointer. So now let's see if this still builds. And it does. And let's run this. And there's still no triangle because we still not call the functions, because we actually have to add the layer now. And to do that, we are going to go into the sandbox.cpp file. And before the game starts, we are going to call the add layer function. And it gets a new sandbox layer. And it doesn't know that because we have to include the file. It's going to be include sandbox layer. What does it want? Is inaccessible. We forgot the, yeah, of course. This needs to be, all of that needs to be public. Let's go back. Now we build that. And now we should, if everything works, we should see the triangle again. There we go. So let's take this apart a bit. I'm going to put a breakpoint here, and we're going to run that with the debugger. So let's jump in here. It's calling the sandbox layers constructor. And this is the layers constructor, like the base class for that. Let's jump over that. Let's jump over that. Now we're going in here, and we see that the layer is put inside of the layers vector. Now we're going to game start. We do all the stuff for the window and for GLFW and for GLAD. And at the end, we are calling the layers init function. Let's jump into that. And we see we are going into the sandbox layers init function, and it's being executed. We see the print inside of the console. Now we're going into game.run. All the stuff like running is true, and then while running, poll events, swap the buffer, and now execute all the layers update function. It's only one. And we're going into sandbox layer update, print and draw. Only one layer. This is also false because the game is supposed to run, and now we are just going to press continue, and we should see the triangle. So if I put a breakpoint inside of the game's shutdown method now, and I'm going to close the window, we break here. Let's go into that. Sandbox layer shutdown, we see a print. Sandbox layer shutdown. Now we delete the object behind the layer pointer, and there's only one layer. Now we shut down the window, and I'm just going to continue, and the game is closing. We're going to go into the game's init method, and we're going to say, like right before they are looped over, we are going to say add layer, and it's just going to be a new layer. The class knows it from the header file, the include. And now we go inside of the layer.cpp file, and we are going to add a print here as well. Engine layer init. And a new line. It's not a count, it's an out. And we need to include IOStream. And I'm going to remove the print from the sandbox layers update method, because that will like print all the time, so we will not see the prints from like init and shutdown. Let me just comment that out. Build. And now if we run this, we can actually also go into the games layer again and also do a print on the shutdown. Just say shutdown. Now let's see how it goes. We built that, and if we run it, I just remove the breakpoint. Then we should see inside of the console, we see sandbox layer in it, and then like the engine layer in it. And if I shut this down now, we will see nothing because there's still a breakpoint. I'm going to remove that and go on continue. And then we see sandbox layer shutdown and the engine layer shutdown. And since this was just a test, I'm going to remove that call to add layer from the game's start function. And if we run it now, we should only see the prints from the sandbox layer. Sandbox layer init, sandbox layer shutdown. Alrighty. The render function we have inside of the layer is not being used for now. Later on, we will put everything that has to do with rendering inside of these functions, so also inside of the sandbox layers render function, but for now we don't need that. And that's it with the implementation. I'm just going to go over it again. We made these layers now. They are a way for us to put code inside of the engine, like from outside of the engine, like within a game code project, for example, this Sandbox project, which we will make, to take code from there and let it be executed by the engine. We have done this via the layer implementation. We made the base class for a layer. Inside of the engine, we made a child class, which derives from the base class inside of our sandbox folder. And then we changed and extended the engine so that these functions instead of these layers will be executed on each frame when it comes to the update method and the render method, and also like once for the init and shutdown methods. And since we are done with implementing code for today, and we are also almost done with the episode, I'm going to put myself into camera full screen mode again. So we have laid the groundwork today to have the possibility to take code from a third project like a Sandbox project or a game code project, whatever game you want to make, and let it be executed by the engine. We have done this via layers. They are pushed inside of a data structure. We use the vector instead of the game class, and then the update method is executed on every frame. The init and shutdown methods are only executed once, and the render function we will talk about later. Next episode, we will talk about overlays, which are also layers, but they only contain, at least in my implementation or in my theory, they only contain UI code. They don't have an update method, they only have a render, init, and shutdown method. But we will talk about that in the next episode. I thank you a lot for watching, and I hope you liked it. If you did, then like the video and subscribe to the channel. And for now, I would just say see you later and bye-bye.